So good morning, everyone. Good morning. How many of you are students in the audience? Wow. This is indeed a fascinating time, I think, for all of you who are students. And if you're thinking about careers in justice and social justice and just systems change in general. So as we stand here today, it's the 20th anniversary of the Violent Crime and Control Act from 1994. That, in some ways, did a lot of good things for criminal justice reform and creating the Office for Violence Against Women, creating the COPS Office, Community-Oriented Policing, and funding a lot of community policing efforts that made a lot of communities safer. But at the same time, that same act is the act that embedded the notion that individuals who were incarcerated weren't deserving of Pell Grants to pay for college educations. So the story there is that always be careful when people talk about reform and that you're paying attention to the details. I mean, you guys as an organization, SPEAR is about Students for Prison Education and Reform, but just always make sure you're looking at the nuanced details. So this great bill that created the COPS Office, which has done a lot for community-oriented policing and a lot for violence against women and a lot of other good things, the same thing wiped away with the stroke of a pen by President Bill Clinton, Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals. We also stand here, it's the 20th anniversary of the War on Poverty. And we know that based on the mass incarceration that we now experience here in the States, in the US, the notion that we're fighting a war on poverty and yet we're sending more and more people to prison each day, and all of the what are called collateral consequences that kind of keep people in poverty, in some ways you could refer to that as perpetual punishment. So not only do individuals come out less able to get a job, less able to get a meaningful job, less able to have a career, but then you have all of these other collateral consequences, including restrictions on voting, if not outright bans on it, restrictions on housing in terms of not being able to reconnect with your family, particularly if you live in housing developments. And again, some of that, again, is looking at the nuances. There's this myth that individuals who live in public housing simply cannot go back by law, and that's just not the case. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development recently issued guidance saying that local housing authorities have the ability to set rules in that regard. So it's not the case that automatically in every city, in every jurisdiction across the country, if you're formerly incarcerated, you can't live with your family. But the question is, do we, as citizens and advocates, do we push our local housing authorities to be more thoughtful about this, to think about the role they can play, to think about what reentry means. What does it mean to welcome returning citizens, and who benefits by having individuals be able to connect with their loved ones? I want to congratulate Terrell for some terrific remarks and say that what he talked about kind of was a great setup in the sense that giving people education as an empowering tool so that they can decide as opposed to giving them a job. So I have the pleasure of directing a national project called Pathways from Prison to Postsecondary Education. I actually should step back. The full title is Unlocking Potential, Pathways from Prison to Postsecondary Education. And the unlocking potential piece of that, even though we often don't talk about it because it just makes the title a bit long, is huge, because what the project is essentially is a nationally funded demonstration that seeks to show that the provision of post-secondary education to individuals who are incarcerated, following them through post-release in the community, will do several things that we should all support. That it, one, will increase post-secondary education attainment by those individuals, so they'll walk away, provided they have the appropriate supports and guidance. They'll walk away with associate's degrees, with bachelor's degrees, with master's degrees, and thus the ability to connect to meaningful, gainful employment, real careers, not just jobs. We're also articulating that if you do this project in the right way, and I'll talk about some of the features of it, that those individuals will be, because they will have their educational credentials, will be able to get increased employment and will be able to better support their families, and thus you're disrupting intergenerational poverty. The third goal is that with those things you reduce recidivism and you improve the quality of life in neighborhoods, and particularly in neighborhoods disproportionately impacted by incarceration. You probably know that in most states in the US, there are particular communities that serve as the huge feeders for the prison population. So you can, again, go to any state and pick usually the major urban cities, and those are the drivers for a large share of your prison population. And then lastly, we want to build an evidence-based case that you can provide in-prison education cost effectively, and that with the appropriate reentry services, it makes a difference, and at the end of the day, it's the right economic decision if you're a policymaker. So the project is funded by the 5 funders, and that's also a very unique thing about the Pathways Project. You know, a lot of times you have these big efforts and there's 1 or 2 funders, and there's 1 or 2 funders who all have sort of similar goals. Well, one of the beauties of Pathways is it's funded by the Ford Foundation, and Ford is funding this through their connection to higher education as an instrument for social justice. It's funded by the Open Society Foundation as a poverty alleviation strategy. We're funded by the William Kellogg Foundation because of their view in family economic security and how you support children and neighborhoods. We're funded by the Sunshine Lady, which believes in the transformative aspect of education. And of all the funders, the Sunshine Lady Foundation is the one who is funding it simply because it's education for prison. Does not matter if it leads to a job, careers, or whatever, just the transformative nature of education, whether you are receiving the death penalty or you only have 6 months. And then lastly, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they actually were the ones who first began to put together this initiative out of their long-term interest in college completion and college success. And so after years of working on that and realizing that as a society, we need to get more and more people to the completion door in terms of college, the Gates Foundation realized that they had ignored the large numbers of people behind bars, many of whom could very much be a part of the college completion agenda, most of whom are coming home at some point. 95% roughly are coming home at some point. So why not see that as a fertile opportunity for individuals to become a part of the college completion agenda and all the good that that serves in terms of being able to have a better trained and better educated workforce, having individuals who are coming out with the credentials and skills that actually match what's happening in the economy. So the other thing about the project, which operates, I should add, in 3 states currently, Michigan, New Jersey through New Jersey STEP, and North Carolina. So those 3 states were selected through a competitive request for proposals process. We actually invited 7 states to apply based on a sense that these 7 states were best poised to do this, had kind of the beginnings of an infrastructure in terms of political support, higher education and prisons that wanted to collaborate and had some track record of collaborating. But importantly, we wanted to bring in the community piece to make sure that the initiative involved all of the necessary wraparound reentry supports that you need. Because an individual coming home, of course, no matter how motivated to focus on education attainment, if the individual is struggling with housing, if the individual is struggling with family support issues, if the individual happens to need a job just for sort of basic subsistence, then you need to be able to make sure those issues are also being addressed. And so our project involves community reentry organizations also supporting in partnership with this. We also very much have an inside-outside continuum such that the colleges from the community, colleges and universities are coming into the prisons, providing the exact same courses that they would be providing on their college campuses. We made it very clear to the states when we put out our request for proposals that we weren't looking for what I call college light. We wanted the exact same credentials by faculty who would come into the prisons to teach. We wanted the exact same course curriculum and syllabus. So what we have are colleges coming in providing curriculum courses that lead directly to a degree. And because it's a program that focuses on individuals who are nearing release in most instances, other than in New Jersey, where there is no time to release criteria for the New Jersey program. In the other 2 states, it focuses specifically on individuals who are 2 to 3 years from release. And we follow them through with all of the supports 2 years post-release, with the goal being that they walk away with some form of a credential. So the colleges not only are making the connection in prison, but those same colleges then are on the receiving end and therefore able to continue to provide the navigational supports. A part of the project includes things like success teams, so that every individual coming out is met with by case managers, is met with by college individuals from the community campuses they'll be attending. so that an individual feels welcome and connected prior to release. To the extent that the individual wants to go to a different college than the one that he or she is being serviced by in prison, those admissions applications and financial paperwork, all of that is done prior to release so that there's a seamless continuation. That brings me to another point. There's another myth out there when we talk about education in prison, and that even though there still exists a ban on Pell Grants for incarcerated individuals, again, it's about the details. What does that mean? Well, what that means is the minute you walk out the door, even if you're on parole, you are, in 90% of the cases, you become re-eligible for it. The only individuals who then still have to go through an appeals process is those who were receiving federal grant while they were convicted, at the time of their conviction. So that's another myth that's out there that enough people don't sort of think about the nuance. People oftentimes leave prison assuming, I have a conviction, I can't go to college. I can't get federal aid. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And the other thing about that, again, nuance, is the ban, because of the way that legislation was written, the ban applies only to individuals who are incarcerated in prisons, not jails. So, for instance, in the state of California, where individuals are going to be doing prison sentences, essentially in county jails, there's a possibility that Pell Grant funding may be used to provide support in the county jails in California. Again, it's about how do you figure out what's the intent of legislation and then what's the actual details. Sometimes it can work in your favor. More often than not, it works against you. Another feature of the project is that, because as I said earlier, we want to build an evidence-based case that this is the right thing to do and it makes sense from a public policy perspective. So we have an independent evaluator, the RAND Corporation, one of the world-renowned research organizations, we've contracted out, and they will evaluate the project, and they'll look at long-term and short-term outcomes and impacts. And one of the things about this evaluation is we're not saying this is a criminal justice initiative. So the outcomes that are going to be looked at are not just about recidivism and rearrest and parole violations. We're going to look at the human outcomes. To what degree that those individuals obtain educational credentials, to what degree, what were the success and retention and completion patterns on their higher education side, how many people consecutively enrolled, semester after semester post-release, to what degree were they able to better provide for their children. So looking at the human impacts of this so that you take it out of it just being this public safety, criminal justice arena, but seeing it as really about community renewal, strengthening families and communities. In addition to the RAND evaluation, there'll be a cost-benefit analysis. So Vera's own cost-benefit analysis unit will take the findings from RAND, and by the way, because it's a 5-year demonstration project, we're talking about 2018 or so. But that's what it takes to build the evidence in order to make the case. So then our cost-benefit analysis unit will take those findings, collect all the cost data, which they've already started doing, to do a serious analysis around. So what does it cost to provide high quality, high impact education in prison with the wraparound reentry supports and with follow through? Lay out the costs and then also measure the benefits in terms of educational benefits, employment, public safety, etc. Another feature of the project is that it involves the expanded use of technology. And we firmly believe that you should have instructors in the classroom. That's a principal stand that we at Vera have taken. But we thought, though, that individuals should not be leaving prison without having exposure to the internet, without being able to at least have keyboarding skills. And so in North Carolina and Michigan, one of the good things about the project is that they are both now, through the project, for the first time ever, having internet access for pathway participants. And for those of you who know a lot about corrections in prisons, you know that's a big deal. Internet in prison exists in very few places. And so we're thrilled that both Michigan and North Carolina are at the forefront of seeing how that works. And granted, they've had their share of problems. There have been what they call virtual breakouts already, but that's to be expected. In a day and age in which you have people who are just naturally gifted at figuring out how to get around all kinds of firewalls and things. The other thing about it is the transferability of the credit. So we ask that every course taught in those prisons, that they absolutely be credit-bearing and transferable to the colleges and universities in those states. We also ask that the states look at their parole supervision policies. When people are opposed to initiatives, particularly one that can be controversial, such as higher ed in prison. Sometimes people find interesting ways to show their opposition. So if you think about it, if you're a parole officer, I don't know, pick a state, and you have an issue with the fact that John was receiving this good quality education while in prison, and now he's home and he's on your caseload. And you have a problem with that. So John comes home, John continues to enroll in prison in college courses. What do you do if you're opposed? You give John a hard time, right? You figure out what his class schedule is, because he has to turn in, he's under supervision, right? Criminal supervision. So technically you have a right to know where you're supposed to be all the time. And so John gives you his course schedule, and you deliberately schedule parole appointments for those times. Those are the kind of things that happen. So as you think about kind of policy stuff, never lose sight of the fact that it's a lot of the operational nuances that can trip up even best intended goals. So we required that as a part of the project that there be specifically assigned parole officers for the pathway participants, that they be trained in how to be supportive, and that they actually begin to write and implement policies that specifically forbid those kind of actions as I just described. So again, what we did was we took a comprehensive look at what are all the things that would get in the way, that could conceivably get in the way of the success of this initiative. How do you create barriers for the individual incarcerated today who simply wants to take advantage of educational opportunities, wants to expand his horizons so he can make the sort of choices that Terrell talked about, figuring out what you want to do in life, get exposure to liberal arts education, decide if you want a technical career track or if you just want a liberal arts education, but you be able to make that decision in a transformative way. And so we thought about at every step along the way, in prison, post-release, parole, corrections, what are all the entities that play a role in this? What are the type of obstructionist behaviors that one could exhibit? And we specifically laid out those concerns in the request for proposals and had the states address them. The other thing about this is a bipartisan effort. We required that the states, in order to apply, their applications needed sign-off from the governor, the chief executive in each state, as well as from the highest-ranking member of both parties in the state legislature, both houses. And so we did that because for us, this isn't a 5-year project that then goes away. This is ultimately about sustainability. And so what we wanted is the states to be clear that should the evidence from the RAND evaluation and the cost-benefit analysis prove positive, then we asked the states to commit to finding the public funding to continue to support this. You know, oftentimes there are these good efforts, good initiatives, well done, but they're pilot, and then it ends. Our contractual agreement, in essence, is if we're right, and recidivism goes down, and people get education, and people get meaningful jobs, then your state should pay for this, because at some point the private funding will go away. And the last thing I want to mention is that we also have a national advisory board. And I think this is also reflective of how important this issue and these issues have become. So our advisory board includes high-ranking officials from the U.S. Department of Justice, from the U.S. Department of Education. We have the Director of Human Resources, Vice President of Human Resources from Johns Hopkins healthcare system out of Baltimore, one of the largest health providers, which, by the way, has a tremendous track record of hiring and retaining formerly incarcerated individuals and supporting them in career tracks, not just jobs. We have a representative from the Bard Prison Initiative, because the other thing about the project is we want to create a learning community. And the one thing that I've experienced in the 2 years that I've been with Vera is it's really wonderful to have colleagues running programs, all with slightly different variations, but all committed to the notion of quality higher education in prison. And so people might think on the surface that if you have BARD and you have Hudson Link and if you have Pathways and if you have Cornell Education and New Jersey STEP, that there's some competition. But the reality is we're all working very well in this space together. We all understand that every life that we are able to touch, that it makes a difference, and touching that life is touching the life of kids and strengthening communities and families. And I think, so Max and I happen to come up on the train together, and I just love the bond. So in some ways, New York was one of the states that was invited. So Max could be upset with me that New York wasn't selected through the RFP process, but not at all. We actually, on a routine basis, collaborate. When he has convenings with liberal arts colleges that are doing some of the work, he invites me, and likewise we have a board person on our advisory board. So I guess the other thing that I didn't mention is to give you a sense of the scale and scope of the project. So in 2013, the project in those 3 states involved 12 prisons in partnership with 17 colleges and universities. 873 students were enrolled, and 145 courses were offered. So in terms of scale and potential impact, it's huge. The other thing I'm pleased to announce is that California will be coming, and I guess we'd have to call them an affiliate of Pathways. So California, beginning this fall, is going to be doing a slightly modified version of the Pathways initiative. But again, it will involve colleges and universities in partnership with prisons, possibly county jails, also with reentry supports and wraparounds. And we're going to do a big kickoff for this California effort in the beginning of May. A huge 3-day convening with the State Attorney General and lots of elected officials and the corrections folks and certainly all of the college and university folks. So I close by simply saying, kind of echoing what Terrell said, that really, education in prison is transformative. It makes a huge difference. I think we have an obligation as a society to provide that. We have to figure out how to get public support for it. I do think that as we think about these issues, we cannot ignore the racial and economic dimensions of this. The reality is, an African-American baby boy born in 2001 has a 1 in 3 chance of doing some time in prison. That Latino baby boy born in that same year has a 1 in 6 chance. And so when we think about mass incarceration and we think about these issues, we have to think about its disproportionate impact on certain communities. And those tend to be low-income minority communities. And at the same time, if you look at the demographics of the nation, those are the same communities that will be the supporters of our social security system and will be the majority of the workforce. So in a lot of ways, this issue is much bigger than criminal justice and corrections. It's really about community renewal. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to follow Fred and meet Terrell and be here with you this morning. Forgive me that my voice is a little not what it normally is, so you'll bear with me. We're running a little short on time, so I will try to be brief. Giving these sort of addresses is not as simple as it used to be, because not that long ago you could assume that nobody knew anything, about this issue, which just isn't really true anymore. Everyone knows now that we have 2.3 or 2.4 million people in prison, that we have way too many people in prison, and that we're making some progress. And in places like New York and New Jersey, we are, rethinking how we do things like sentencing and solitary confinement and parole and education in particular. And, for those of us who've been working on this issue for 5 or 10 or 15 years or longer, it's really an amazing moment. It's really a moment that for a lot of people it felt like it would just never come. But one thing that I really enjoyed about both Terrell and Fred's comments were, the suggestions of some caution about how we proceed with this reform. And we have in the past, when it comes to criminal justice policy, gotten carried away in all kinds of different ways. And we need to be careful about how we go about this now that we have so much attention. There are a lot of different ways we could do it. But when it comes to the issue that we're talking about today, which is education, I'd suggest that all that knowledge about whether or not we have too many people in prison and who they are and all that is secondary, or maybe even not relevant. That is to say, if you put all the social considerations to the side, right? Or put it this way, ask a provocative, maybe condescending question, right? Because you know what the answer is going to be, is how many people in this room think that somehow we're preparing young Americans for the challenge of the 21st century, right? Nobody, right? That's easy, right? And again, you move all those mass incarcerations, problems of class, problems of ethnicity, problems of race, and how this relates to the successes and failures of the civil rights revolution. All that is true. But you push that to the side for a moment, and you just ask yourself, is the level of educational attainment for the average white middle-class male in this country what it needs to be? And the answer is no. It's abysmal, right? So we need all hands on deck in how we rethink how institutions like this university, how colleges like Bard, how community colleges across the country, all the states that Fred is partnering with, Rutgers certainly, we need to rethink how we provide access to education and provide as many outlets as possible. We need to really consider how we fail to inspire young people to really do learning that speaks to careers and speaks to democratic participation in all kinds of new ways, and think of how we can reinvigorate the whole process of education and democratic participation if we want to maintain our stature in the world and our standard of living. And to do that, we have to have some willingness to be creative and some willingness to be courageous. And that brings me to the work that we do at Bard and BPI, which is, as Fred alluded to, bringing a very high-end liberal arts education to people in prison, primarily about 300 students in New York. But we also have a consortium partnering with schools across the country where we have a total of 700 students enrolled across 9 states. And the symbolic power of that work lies, again, in where it fits in the discussions about education, I think, as much as in criminal justice, right? We have assumed so often over the last generation that, bubble tests and vocational education and training for particular jobs, which tend not to exist when people complete the training for those jobs, is always the way to go, right? And that studying history and the arts, really honoring the arts, mathematical literacy, all these things are somehow something that young people are either not interested in or not capable of, right? And of course, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because we don't provide any access to it, right? So in the prisons, we have a whole series, really a series of satellite campuses where students enroll at an extraordinarily high level right off the bat who come with very little formal preparedness, and we can talk about what that means a little bit, maybe later, and go on to achieve at the same level of those kids who come to Bard's main campus from, the fanciest high schools in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or across the world. And that's because we treat them the same way we treat those other students. And because they really feel, they become convinced that something's at stake for them. So many of those students move from algebraic illiteracy to be able to do calculus, to go on to be math majors. Students study sociology or anthropology so they can be more effective organizers or social workers in the communities where they come from that are most afflicted by the problems of crime and incarceration. Some are interested in the arts and learn to read French or German or Chinese so they can read their favorite literature in the original language, right? It's a full education which dignifies the student and assumes the most of them and commits to them that we'll go as far with them as they're willing to go with us, right? And it's been extraordinarily successful. I'm so glad both of these guys who spoke before me talked about the limits of how people like to typically measure the success of what we do. There's typically one metric with which people measure our success. And it's not whether they become happier people or better parents or treat people in a better way, right? It's whether or not they go back to prison, right? And can you imagine a lower bar for, does anyone here send their children to a school and say, well, how many of these people, go back to prison? That's not how it happens. That's not how you achieve any kind of success. So, we like to be provocative and polemical talking about it and saying we'd be thrilled to be the college and program that had the highest rate of recidivism in history if we also had the most people that were middle or upper middle class taxpayers, the most people that were helping the most people in the communities where they come from, the most people who are going on to graduate degrees so they can really impact the scholarship on this question in the future. They can really impact the policy discussions that affect their communities in the future. They can be artists, etc., right? So we're not going to set the bar as low as you're a person and our goal is to get you out of prison and not come back, whether it's pushing a mop or being on public assistance or what have you. Not that there's anything wrong with those things. But that's not what we're in it for. We're in for creating an environment where you feel inspired in a different kind of way. So the recidivism question is a very big one. But really the question to me is going back and thinking about how we thought about these people as young people, right? And to think that these are the same people who the best social scientists a generation ago were literally writing off, or referring to as super predators, or hopeless, right? And yet we now know, that if you treat them a little differently, they can do these extraordinary things. And so what's really most exciting, I think, when you think about the success of our students who are now studying at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia or the Yale Divinity School or earning PhDs or, again, running programs in their communities or running businesses, right, is thinking about how, if you looked at those young people when they were going to prison and you told the average educator or the average jailer or the average voter that these are the kinds of things this person could and would be accomplishing in a relatively short period of time, they would say that is impossible. That's what everyone would say. And so what I hope we learn from our success in really reforming and really transforming prison education over the next few years, because we will do that thanks to folks like Fred and a whole slew of allies that are coalescing around the country and in New York and in New Jersey. What I hope we take from that isn't that, okay, we'll have fewer people in prison and it'll be fabulous, that we'll have a little less recidivism and we'll waste a little less money on these institutions that really don't deliver us anything. If we do that, we will have failed. What we need to take from our success in this issue that we will have is the lesson that when we look at people who don't behave the way we hope they'll behave, is to remember that people are capable of things that we think are impossible, and we have to create institutions which dignify them and speak to the best of their capacity. And if we do that, we will serve ourselves and the country far better than we have in the past. Thank you.